Okay, I'm just gonna finish knocking this out. I don't know what happened. I paused it before because when I came across the paradinin dianodioxin, I was just curious to see if I couldn't pull up on my phone if I could get a list of different pigments in corals for photosynthesis. That didn't happen, and then this fabulous PC just logged itself off. So that video cut short. So there's gonna be 3 videos. One is 50 minutes. The last one I did is like 7.5, and this one hopefully is gonna be around 5. Perfect. Anyways, we're pretty well versed in corals. So xanthal, and it really depends on what they have. It really the more light exposure they have, the brighter that they can actually be, and the more they're going to expose that. Same thing with us in a tan. The more light exposure we have, the darker we're going to get to try and counteract those wavelengths and that kind of absorption. All right. During coral stress, so if the temperature is too cold, the sunlight's too far away, it's too acidic, the water is not at an optimum pH, or it's too salty, it's too fresh. You have any sort of like algal bloom above it. Like, this is why corals like to live in places that have low nutrient concentration, because the nutrients are going to actually cause other organisms to be there and start, like start absorbing light out of the water. And it's really not going to have a chance to reach anything down on a substrate. And we know that corals have to live on a rocky substrate and live on the ground. So yeah, if you have like little phytoplankton above you sucking in all that sunlight, it's not going to reach them. So they would like to be in a place where phytoplankton are not. So places with heavy nutrient amounts are going to be maybe a place they would avoid. After bleaching, the coral can be recolonized by different species of zooxanthellae. So the coral can change its color multiple times. If you've never seen a coral bleach itself and expel its zooxanthellae, watch this video. It's pretty short. Seagrasses are not seaweed. Seagrasses are not seaweed. Okay. Seagrasses are green flowering plants that can grow on the seabed. There's about 60 different species. They're all in the photic zone. They can produce oxygen, obviously, for the food web. They are a main food source for turtles and manatees and herbivorous fish, or fish that eat green matter or like plant matter. They're a nursery and they're a habitat. They're really good for anchoring soil. They stop turbidity from increasing because they're, instead of sediment getting washed around, it gets like, if this is seagrass, the sediment comes, hits, and gets trapped down. Plus, the roots will anchor and pull in the soil. So, or not even soil, but the gravel, whatever substrate, your sandy substrate. So you don't have as much turbidity and particles being suspended throughout your water column. They also slow down water currents, making it safer for organisms to, attach their eggs there or stop there and kind of like harbor themselves. Root system stabilizes substrate, great, reduces erosion and wave damage, so it can help coastal communities and humans. And then 10% of the ocean's total carbon storage is actually in seagrass meadows and in seagrasses. So again, they're a carbon sink. It's awesome. All right. And their adaptations. And what do we have? Only 37 slides. 38. Ugh. All right. So seagrass adaptations. Look at, they have like long roots, not like horizontally long roots, and then it's like pocketing themselves in. So there's a well-developed root system with thick horizontal rhizomes. You can see what a rhizome is right here. And then if we want to, compare it to like this drawing above it, these are your rhizome areas towards the bottom. The rhizomes are going to connect them to like their root shoot. Okay. Look at all of that. Help for transferring water, help for transferring sugars. I don't know if you can see that. Doesn't matter. Made a really strong cellulose. There we go. They anchor into the seagrass, the seabed, so it doesn't move by shifting water. Rhizomes allow grasses to reproduce asexually, so they just make more of themselves. Just make more of themselves off the root. The cells are adapted to seawater, so they don't lose water through osmosis. because the water inside of their cells should be pretty fresh. The water outside of them is going to be salty. Water moves from a high water potential to a low water potential, or from a high area concentration to a low area of water concentration. So technically, the water inside of this plant should move out to try and put the ocean in equilibrium with it. That's never going to happen. So instead of that happening, we have really strong cell walls here to stop osmosis from happening. Yeah, it can happen on its own because it's not like water is soluble through a lipid or through a cell membrane. Remember, on your cell membranes, you have aquaporins. Aquaporins are proteins that allow water to come in and out because the cell membrane is hydrophobic. Specialized tissues in the cell called parenchyma. The tissues contain air and deliver it to all of the submerged areas of the plant. You can see these in here. All right. The leaf structure has an epidermis layer, so a top layer, with chloroplast to maximize photosynthesis. There's no stomata. In inland plants, we have stomata. Stomata actually allow transpiration to happen, water loss, which isn't always great. Stomata also will take in carbon dioxide and release oxygen. This is the top of a leaf. Stomata is underneath the leaf, and it's almost like little nostrils. Remember, they're guarded by guard cells that can open and close. In a cam plant or a cactus plant, those guard cells are always closed during the day to prevent any kind of transpiration. And then they'll just harness all that sun energy and then just open their stomatas at night so that the temperature won't be as hot. They're not going to lose all their water. Okay, so there's chloroplast, no stomata, and a very thin waxy cuticle so that the wax is to help water loss, but the thinness is so that they can take in mineral ions directly from the water. Minerals, if we just minerals are not nutrients. Minerals are not nutrients. Minerals are not nutrients. These were your minerals. This is chapter 7. You guys did a lot of minerals. A lot of this came from the volcano. Minerals. They need it. No vascular bundles like xylem or phloem. They don't need to do that. Xylem moves water up a plant because the roots absorb the water and then it moves it up the plant. But you don't need to do that in an aquatic water plant, of course. Okay. The leaves are also very flexible. That's good because they're going to be moving through a water current. If your leaves outside, your palms weren't flexible. Oh, look, they're moving right now. I'm sure you can't see them because it's really bright. You can't see them, but they're moving right now. If the palms weren't flexible, they would snap right off, and then that would be the end of that. Oh gosh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cough there. So that just helps with any kind of current moving or current resistance. They can reproduce sexually or asexually. In sexual reproduction, they're going to release pollen and fertilize and make flowers. Anytime the plant is making flowers, it's a sexually reproducing plant. It can self-fertilize, but the flower is like the male and female organ of the flower. It's in reproduction mode. And I always say just because a plant doesn't have a flower on it does not mean it's dead. That just means it's not mating season. Just because you're not pregnant doesn't mean you're dead. It's just that mating season. And it means that you're not married, you didn't graduate, you don't have health insurance, you don't have a car, you don't have car insurance, you don't have money. Okay, great. Okay, here's your seagrass, your turtle eating it. Look at this right here. It's a tag. Do you see it off on its pectoral fin, flipper, appendage? This is a tag. This would be for like mark and recapture. 2 slides left. Okay, so in shallow water, so we just looked at the open ocean. Biggest thing there was things are going to freely float. They don't have a substrate shallow enough to attach to. And we didn't do intertidal. That's the next one. Again, in another shallow water adaptation to seagrasses. So they're going to be within an area they can attach to a substrate and still do photosynthesis. Could be within that 200 meter mark. This was the question we did together on Thursday. Sorry, Friday was at Science Fair. On Thursday, the one last year that they had, and I was showing you in the topic support guide. Read the topic support guide because that was like right where that answer was. Shallow water adaptations for kelp. Okay. So in clear coastal waters, again, light can penetrate. same thing that we had at the top on the other slide, your shallow water adaptations. Your species so far have been zooxanthellae living in coral and seagrasses. Kelp forests, they are long, really long. I guess a forest, so it can't be super shallow and it can't be an open ocean because it's too deep, and it definitely can't be intertidal because you might only change by 3 meters, and that's not long enough for a forest of kelp. So the adaptations for your kelp forest, they are macroalgae. They're a brown macroalgae. The brown is good. If I go all the way back, I don't know how far it's going to go, but it's worth it. I went pretty far. We saw in Thursday that question that we did that the students had last year, that first page, where they were looking at the different areas that they could live, and they didn't know what the answer was, but we found it in the topic support guide. Again, if we look here, your reds can only go to like 25, 20 meters. And that kelp was 40 meters long. So it was like in this region. Well, red is not an option for it then. If it just had chlorophyll, that kelp would not be, it would never be able to survive. It's a horrible adaptation. If that was all it had was just chlorophyll, it would only be able to take in the blue region, it would outcompete and die. Instead, though, it's brown algae, so it has adaptations. It has an accessory pigment that is able to take in your middle wavelengths. So red is not an option because, again, the example we saw, it was living in 40. So red is gone. So it's able to take in all of your blues and greens. I'm tired. Okay, and then yellows. Bug. Okay. Trying brown macroalgae, great. They need nutrient-rich water because they're so big. They're gonna need nutrients to grow. They're very big. They need nutrient-rich water, so it's good that they are going to be off the tidal area. Temperature of 8 degrees Celsius to 16 degrees Celsius, so it's anywhere from 46 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit. We don't have kelp forests over here. Our water will be too warm in Florida, but off the coast of California, they have a lot of kelp forests. Oh, it's a bug. Cool. The species Macrocystis, that was the extra credit on your guys' vocab quiz, can grow up to 0.5 meter a day and can reach 80 meters in length total. That is like, literally, it takes it 40 days to grow really, really tall. 80 meters is really tall. Again, if it went back to that previous slide, being in 80 meters, like, you can't just be having chlorophyll. You definitely need to take in more. They generate vast biodiversity, much like a rainforest. They're going to slow down water. They're going to stop currents. They're going to help coastal erosion. They're going to be a nursery ground. They're going to be a habitat. They're going to be protection. Sea otters on the surface will hold on to the kelp below them so that they don't keep floating away, and it keeps them in place. They create oxygen, so it's really good for the organisms living around it. Sea otters eat sea urchins. Sea urchins live on the bottom of the substrate. The urchins like nom, 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 just mow across and eat down the kelp. So if the kelp is super long, here's the substrate, and the sea urchins just come and just mow this down. It's not like just picking off a couple, leaves off the top. You're cutting it all down. It's like deforestation. When the sea otters were heavily hunted, I don't know, like in the 1800s, could be 1700s. I don't recall. Could be 18, could be early 19. It doesn't matter. Sea otters were heavily hunted for their fur because their fur is extremely water resistant and really warm. So sailors were like, yeah, I want that. They were hunted for their fur. They noticed a lot of their fish yields were going down. A lot of their fish species weren't there anymore. They weren't getting the same amount of fish. And what had happened was the sea otters will swim down and take an urchin, you bring it back up to the top, smash it, eat it. Awesome. They were controlling the urchin population. Again, urchins are like a semicircular shelled organism, and they're going to come down and they're an herbivore. They're just going to mow down that kelp and eat it. Okay, well, if there's no otters, then that sea urchin population is going to flourish. And now it's like you have 100,000 lawnmowers just mowing down all that kelp. If you have your otters there, they can control all those lawnmowers and they can keep that population stable. Okay. The entire body of the kelp is called a thallus, all the way up the top. So, like the stem is called the thallus, and it's 3 main parts. It has a holdfast, and it allows it to hold onto something. It's like an anchor. It's not for mineral absorption. It's not for mineral absorption. They can do that through their very thin, waxy cuticle on the outside. The thin, waxy cuticle on the outside. Almost every, I don't want to say every, it's pretty absolute, but all plants are going to have a waxy cuticle on the outside to stop water loss, especially when it gets warm. And theirs is very thin, so minerals are going to come in that way, just through diffusion. If you have a high concentration of minerals outside the water, low concentration inside the plant, it'll naturally diffuse in. The stipe are long, tough vertical stalks like a stem. And it's tough enough to prevent breakage whenever it's moving back and forth in a lot of water. Okay, and this whole thing here is called the thallus. Blades are the actual like leaves. So these are broadleaf structures that hang in the water. They have large surface area, really big, right? If we're trying to tan and take in all the light we can, bug. We're not going to do this. We're not going to like hold our bodies in. We're going to like expose our bodies and take in all the sunlight we can. So they don't want to have these tiny little, little leaf-like structures that are wrapped or anything like that. They're open. They're like solar panels. Large surface area again, so much exposure for light and for minerals. And the fact that it's thin as well allows it to not be really weighted. And then, of course, they have the nematocysts, which are like your gas bubbles that keep them floating. And if there's a strong current, they would just be like this. Instead, they can be a little bit like this because they're floating. Okay. Okay, last page. So in our intertidal zone, things we need to avoid here are going to be freezing and desiccation, and then overexposure and those things are from overexposure. So it's the area of the shore between high and low tide. We did a lot of practice. We had a lot of practice questions, but we spent a lot of time heavily looking at the intertidal zone in Maine. The littoral zone is the benthic or bottom zone in between your high spring tide and low spring tide. So the littoral zone is literally on the bottom. The intertidal zone is the entire area in between the tides. The littoral zone is the substrate area in between the tides, so the bottom. The intertidal is the whole like water column above the tide, your high highs and low lows. And then the littoral zone is the seafloor part of it, the substrate of it. Producers are going to have difficulties. This is where it's going to be a struggle to live in the intertidal zone, where like the open ocean, it's a struggle to be able to anchor yourself, so you just freely float. Their air exposure could have desiccation or freezing. If you are an organism living in a freezing temperature, like the Fucus borealis, it did have adaptations to stop that and to not expose their surface area as much. They did twist themselves up. Water submersion can reduce the exposure to the light spectrum or to like the red area. Again, red can only go about 20 some meters. And that's provided that you don't have a lot of turbidity and wave action or even runoff clogging that with nutrients just clogging the water. And then tidal movement. So the risk of being washed away or your substrate moving and then you moving along with it. All right, and the species that live there and then their adaptations, so how they can combat that. So we have Fucus borealis. We looked at this heavily. This was the area of shore C on our assignment. This was the one that was heavily exposed to air and exposed to water, but more exposure to air. This was also the one that didn't freeze. This was also the one that did not release any of its cell contents. There was no amino acids inside of the solution that it was put in after they put it in freezing temperature because it didn't die and its cells didn't break. The water didn't pop it or anything like that. So they're a brown algae, macroalgae. We can see it. It's macro. It's found in the middle intertidal zone. Very thick cell walls to reduce water loss. The fronds are spiral thick to reduce evaporation and to trap water, so they don't have desiccation happening. There's a holdfast that attaches to rocks to prevent being washed away. The common name is spiral rack. Oh, geez, I'm not even going to say it. Exasperates. Don't want to say it. I feel like something's missing there. Chondr. There's a letter missing. It's not that big of a deal, but I insist. Oh, it's chondrochanthus. Chondrochanthus. Should be DRA. Chondrochanthus exasperates. It's a red algae, so it has the phytoetherins. It is not absorbing the red spectrum. that grows low in the beach, spends most of the time submerged, up to even 20 meters, and is able to absorb sunlight wavelengths in deeper water, hence why it's red. So it can live below the red spectrum. Has a hold fast to keep it attached. So far both these have had a hold fast to keep it attached. And then Ovolacto is green algae found throughout the shoreline. Move myself up. And has a hold fast, a small one, because it's not a huge organism. It grows in a more sheltered area, probably an area where you also have seagrasses, so it's not going to be the only thing breaking down all of that current movement. It can detach and lives a free form and then reattach itself. It's very tolerant of high mineral content and can live in tide pools. Meaning what happens whenever the tide goes out and it's low tide and now it's stuck in a tidal pool. It will be in a tidal pool because it wants to be attached to a holdfast. Its adaptation, or wants to use its holdfast and be attached to a substrate rather. Its adaptation is that it doesn't always have to be. It can take the the issue of being pushed away off something and then float and then reattach itself. But so what if that happened and it was stuck in a rocky tide pool area? It's going to have a lot of mineral exposure, a lot of magnesiums, a lot of chlorines, phosphates, sodium ions. So that's gonna cause it to lose a lot of its own particles. So it has resistance to that. Oh my gosh, we're done. We're done, we're done, we're done. And I still have some time of olive snap ready. Yay. Cool, awesome. So again, the biggest thing on here, know your graphs, know your not enzymes, but know your I want to say enzymes too, but pigments, your accessory pigments, color code them, color code them, color code them. You don't have too many you have to know. Color code them. Color code them. No questions 17, A, B, and C, no 25 and 26, no 38. Surely there's more that I'm not touching on, but those are the ones that are coming to mind really well. Know the different adaptations for living in different areas. In the open ocean, it's too deep. You do have light exposure, but it's too deep, so you have to be a free floater. In the shallow water, you need to just be able to attach yourself. And depending on how deep you are, you should have adaptations to absorb different wavelengths. And then in your intertidal zone, your adaptations are to attach yourself and avoid desiccation. Know the graphs about exposure or like wavelength exposure. Why sargassum is such a good habitat for other organisms. Oh, there's a dolphin swimming through it. I saw dolphins yesterday. No nematocysts. Okay, limiting factors. Know the limiting factors. Listen to me talk about those graphs again if you need. They should line up with the answers really good on 17, A, B, and C that I scanned through you. Why it wouldn't be good to live in an area where there was a lot of light absorption, like metabolically, you really wouldn't have a lot of oxygen. How turbidity will affect it. And your pigments, light penetration. You got this. No photosynthesis, obviously. Obviously. Know that. Remember that zooxanthellae is not phytoplankton. It does not freely float. Okay. All right. Hey, guys. I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.